Hey guys, we often picture medieval Europe through the glow of illuminated manuscripts and stone cathedrals. Yet for the millions who actually lived there, the most faithful companion in their daily existence was something far more ordinary and far less romantic: mud. Not the occasional puddle after rain, but a thick, persistent, ankle-deep reality that coated paths, streets, and fields from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Holy Roman Empire, year after year, century after century. It wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was simply the ground they walked on, and it shaped nearly everything about how their days unfolded. If you're listening from somewhere around the world tonight, drop a quick comment and let me know where you are and which corner of history you'd like to explore next. If these calm, thoughtful journeys into the past help you unwind, a like is a gentle way to support more of them. And if you enjoy slipping into these long, immersive stories, I'd be grateful if you subscribed so the next one finds you easily. Tonight, let's step quietly back into that world and feel, as closely as the records allow, what it was truly like to walk through mud every single day in medieval Europe. The story begins not in the grand squares of Paris or London, but on the narrow tracks that laced the countryside. Most people, perhaps 9 out of 10, lived outside the walls of towns, in villages of timber and thatch clustered around a church and a manor house. Between those villages lay the open fields, the woods, and the commons, all connected by paths worn down by centuries of feet, hooves, and wooden cartwheels. In the mild, damp climate that dominated northern and western Europe, rain fell gently but often. The soil, heavy with clay in many places, refused to drain quickly. A single shower could turn a well-trodden lane into a ribbon of soft, sucking earth that clung to every step. Imagine rising before first light in a small wattle and daub cottage. You pull on your simple wool tunic and, if you are lucky, a pair of leather shoes or wooden clogs. The poorest might go barefoot or wrap their feet in rags. You step outside into the yard, and already the ground gives slightly beneath you. By the time you reach the edge of the village, the mud has begun to build up along the sides of your footwear, adding weight with every stride. On a typical morning, you might walk a mile or two to the strips of land you farmed under the open field system. Each step pulls at your legs. The mud does not merely wet your feet. It works its way between toes, under straps, and into seams. By midday, your shoes feel twice as heavy, and the hem of your garment is darkened and stiffened with it. This was not an inconvenience reserved for the poor. Even the lord of the manor, riding out to inspect his domain, found his horse's hooves sinking inches deep in places. Carts carrying grain or timber frequently bogged down, requiring teams of oxen or extra villagers to free them. A journey that should have taken an hour could stretch into 3, and every delay mattered when daylight hours were precious and the harvest window narrow. Contemporary accounts, though sparse, speak of miry ways and foul roads, as though they were simply the expected condition of the land. One 14th-century chronicler noted without surprise that after heavy autumn rains the paths around his monastery became almost impassable for days. What made the mud so relentless was a combination of factors that medieval people understood perfectly well but could not easily change. First came the climate. Much of Europe lay under the influence of the North Atlantic, bringing frequent drizzle and occasional downpours. Drainage ditches existed around some fields, but maintaining them required labor that competed with plowing, sowing, and reaping. Second, the very success of medieval agriculture worked against clean footing. The 3-field rotation system meant large areas lay fallow each year, their soil loosened by the plow and easily churned into paste by passing animals. Cattle, sheep, and pigs wandered the lanes between pastures and byres, adding their own contribution to the mixture. The result was not clean earth, but a heavy, organic slurry that stuck fast and smelled of the farmyard. In the countryside, people adapted with quiet practicality. Many wore pattens, wooden overshows raised on iron rings or thick blocks that kept the leather or fabric of the main shoe clear of the worst of the mud. These clattered along the paths like small wooden stilts and left distinctive circular impressions that archaeologists still find in preserved trackways. Wealthier peasants and small landholders might own a second pair of sturdier boots kept specifically for winter travel. Yet even these measures had limits. After a long day, the pattens themselves became caked, their rings filling with compacted earth until they offered little advantage. Cleaning them at the cottage door was a nightly chore performed by firelight, scraping and rinsing with whatever water could be spared. As we move from the fields toward the villages and small market towns, the character of the mud changes but never truly disappears. Inside the village, the main street might be slightly raised or scattered with gravel where the Lord had ordered improvements. Yet after market day, the droppings of sheep and cattle mixed with spilled grain and the runoff from thatched roofs to create a new, darker sludge. Householders were sometimes required by manorial custom to keep the stretch of road in front of their door free of the worst filth. But enforcement varied. A visitor arriving after dark might still step knee-deep into an unseen hollow filled with the day's accumulations. Here the daily rhythm of mud began to touch social life more visibly. Women carrying water or bundles of firewood learned to judge the safest line across the street by long habit. Children played at the edges where the ground was firmer, their bare feet black by supper time. When a wedding or a saint's day brought the community together, the procession to the church moved carefully, the bride lifting her skirts with one hand while steadying herself with the other. Even the parish priest, stepping out to ring the bell for vespers, would pause on the threshold and glance down at the ground before committing to the short walk across the churchyard. The deeper we look, the more we see how mud quietly ordered priorities and limited possibilities. Trade moved more slowly and at greater cost than we sometimes imagine. A merchant bringing wool from the Cotswolds to a port on the Channel might lose days waiting for a flooded track to firm up. Prices rose not only because of distance, but because of the sheer physical difficulty of moving goods through saturated earth. News traveled the same slow, muddy routes. A royal proclamation issued in London might take weeks to reach a remote manor in Yorkshire, its messenger arriving mud-spattered and exhausted. Warfare itself had a seasonal rhythm shaped by the ground. Armies preferred to campaign in summer when the roads, though still imperfect, were drier and horses could move without foundering. Winter sieges were rarer partly because supply lines sank into the mire. Yet people did not simply endure. They built small, practical defenses against it. In some regions, villagers laid bundles of brushwood or faggots across the worst sections of track, creating rough corduroy roads that gave a firmer footing for a season or two before they too sank. In the Low Countries, where the struggle against water was constant, early experiments with raised causeways and wooden walkways appeared centuries before the great dike projects of later eras. In England and France, monasteries sometimes maintained stretches of paved road near their gates, using whatever local stone was cheapest, but these short stretches only highlighted how exceptional they were. Most people never walked on anything resembling a modern hard surface in their entire lives. Inside the larger towns, the contrast grows sharper, yet the mud refuses to yield entirely. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many market squares boasted at least partial cobbling, rounded stones set into the earth to provide better drainage and footing for horses and carts. These surfaces were a genuine luxury, paid for by guilds or civic taxes, and they represented real civic pride. Even so, the spaces between the cobbles filled quickly with dirt and organic debris carried in on boots and wheels. After rain, the streets became a mosaic of slick stone and soft channels of mud. Householders tossed their kitchen waste and chamber pot contents into the street or into open gutters that ran down the center. The resulting mixture was unpleasant underfoot and occasionally hazardous. Contemporary coroners' rolls record occasional deaths by drowning in particularly deep and neglected street pools. Wealth offered some protection, but never a complete escape. A prosperous merchant in a town like Bruges or York might own patens with carved bone or ivory inlays, or employ a servant to sweep the approach to his door each morning. His wife could afford longer gowns lined with finer wool that dragged less obviously through the filth. Yet when they walked to Mass or to the Guildhall, they still lifted their feet with the same practiced caution as their poorer neighbors. The very wealthiest might ride in litters or on horseback, but even then the animal's legs would emerge streaked and heavy. Mud respected no rank. It simply waited for everyone who needed to move from one place to another. As the afternoon light begins to fade across the medieval countryside, we can picture the slow homeward journey once more. The same path you walked at dawn now feels different, heavier, more reluctant. The mud has had all day to settle and compact under the passage of hundreds of feet. Your legs ache in a way that modern walkers rarely experience. A deep, low-grade fatigue born not of distance alone but of constant resistance. At the cottage door you pause, scrape what you can from your shoes, and step inside to the warmth of the hearth. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again, unchanged except perhaps by the weather. If the rain holds off, the ground may firm a little. If it falls, the mud will be deeper still. This was not a world without beauty or ingenuity. The cathedrals rose, the illuminated books were copied, the songs were sung. Yet beneath all of it lay the patient, unromantic earth that people negotiated every day of their lives. The mud was not a temporary hardship to be endured until better times. It was the baseline condition of existence, as ordinary as breathing. Understanding that changes how we see the pace of medieval life, the shape of its communities, and the quiet resilience required simply to go about one's business. We have only begun to trace how this daily encounter with the ground influenced clothing, diet, law, and even belief. In the next stretch of our journey, we will step inside the towns more fully, examine how urban authorities tried, and often failed, to manage the streets, and discover how the very same mud that slowed carts also preserved fragments of the past for us to find centuries later. The paths ahead are still long, and the ground is still soft beneath our feet. The paths ahead are still long, and the ground is still soft beneath our feet. As we move from the open fields and village lanes into the more densely packed world of medieval towns, the mud does not vanish. It simply changes its character, becoming more layered with human activity and more tightly regulated, though never truly conquered. By the high Middle Ages, places like London, Paris, Bruges, or the prosperous wool towns of Flanders had grown into centers of several thousand souls, their streets a patchwork of ambition and practicality. Civic leaders understood that clean passage mattered for trade, for prestige, and for public order, yet the same heavy soils and persistent rains that plagued the countryside pressed just as insistently against stone walls and timber gates. Consider a typical market day in a town such as York or Ghent around the year 1300. The main thoroughfare leading to the marketplace might boast a central strip of cobbles or flattened gravel, laid at no small expense by the Guild of Merchants or the town corporation. These surfaces offered a firmer tread for those who could afford to keep to the middle of the road, but the edges remained soft, especially where rainwater drained from overhanging eaves or where servants emptied slops from upper windows. Householders were bound by town statutes to maintain the section of street before their own doors, sweeping refuse into the central channel or kennel that ran downhill toward the river. Yet compliance was uneven. A prosperous dyer or weaver might pave his frontage with broken tiles or oyster shells to create a slightly raised platform, while a poorer neighbor simply scattered fresh straw each morning, knowing it would turn to mush by noon. The result was a street that felt alive underfoot, rising and falling in texture with every few paces, the mud never far from claiming its share of attention. Urban authorities did try, in their measured way, to impose order. Surviving records from places like Southampton or Cologne show repeated ordinances against casting dung, night soil, or workshop waste into the ways. Fines were set for butchers who allowed blood and offal to pool, or for tanners whose pungent runoff turned lanes into sticky hazards. In some towns, a dedicated scavenger or raker was paid from the common chest to clear the worst accumulations, pushing a wooden barrow along the kennel at dawn or dusk. These efforts spoke of genuine civic pride and an awareness that foul streets invited disease and discouraged visitors. Yet the limits were practical ones. Labor was expensive, carts for removal were few, and the very volume of daily life overwhelmed the system. A single heavy rain could undo a week's work, washing debris back into the channels and softening every surface anew. Chroniclers occasionally grumbled about the stench rising in summer heat, but they described it as part of the town's ordinary pulse, not a crisis to be solved once and for all. For the people who moved through these streets every day, the mud shaped routines in ways both small and profound. A merchant hurrying to the Guildhall might wear finer leather boots than his rural cousin, yet he still carried a pair of pattens tucked under his arm or slung from a strap, slipping them on at the threshold to elevate his soles above the worst of the slurry. Artisans in the narrower alleys, where sunlight rarely reached the ground, learned to judge the depth of each puddle by the color of the water or the bubbles rising from disturbed refuse. Women heading to the baker's or the brewer's lifted their skirts with one hand while balancing a basket on the other hip, their wooden clogs clacking against any firmer patches. Children, barefoot or in simple rag wrappings, darted between adults with the agility born of long practice. Their feet permanently stained the color of the earth. Even the town watch, making their rounds after curfew, moved with deliberate care, lanterns swaying as they tested each step to avoid the deeper troughs that could swallow a boot or twist an ankle. What strikes the modern imagination most quietly is how thoroughly this condition was accepted as normal. Letters and account books from the period rarely complain about mud as though it were unusual. Instead, they note practical consequences. A shipment of wine delayed because the carrier's cart sank to the axles outside the city gate. A wedding party arriving at the church with hems darkened and shoes ruined. The bride's father quietly paying extra to have the porch swept beforehand. The mud became, in its way, a silent arbitrator of status. Those who could afford servants to clean footwear or maintain private passages enjoyed a small but noticeable margin of comfort. Others simply planned their movements around the weather and the rhythms of the street. On market days, the press of bodies and animals turned the square itself into a churned expanse where buyers and sellers negotiated prices while standing calf-deep in the mixture of trodden straw, spilled grain, and animal droppings. The haggling continued undeterred. Commerce had learned to accommodate the ground rather than wait for it to improve. Beneath this daily negotiation lay subtler influences on health and community life. The constant dampness at foot level encouraged chilblains and fungal infections that physicians of the time treated with herbal poultices or simple prayers. Midwives attending births in cramped upper rooms warned new mothers about keeping infants' feet dry, knowing how quickly a chill could settle into the lungs. Yet the same mud that complicated movement also acted as a preservative. Layers of silt and organic matter, compacted over generations, sealed away fragments of everyday existence in ways that drier climates could not. Archaeologists working in the waterlogged deposits of medieval towns have recovered thousands of leather shoes, their soles worn thin in patterns that reveal the gait of long-dead owners. Wooden pattens with their iron rings still attached, fragments of woven rush matting once laid across thresholds. Even the occasional lost coin or child's toy pressed into the earth and forgotten. These finds do not romanticize the past. They simply remind us that the mud was not only an obstacle but a quiet archive, holding the imprint of lives lived close to the ground. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, some towns began experimenting with more ambitious solutions. In London, the mayor and aldermen ordered the widening of certain drains and the occasional laying of additional gravel on key routes to the river wharves. In Paris, the royal administration under Philip Augustus had earlier paved sections of the main streets with stone, an investment that later kings maintained and expanded where funds allowed. These improvements were real, yet they remained. The side lanes and the areas beyond the walls stayed much as they had always been, soft and yielding after any prolonged rain. Travelers entering a town from the countryside often remarked on the contrast between the open mire of the approach roads and the relative firmness of the better streets. But the transition was never absolute. Mud still waited at every corner, every market stall, every stable yard. We begin to see, too, how this constant encounter with the earth threaded its way into law and custom. Manorial and borough courts heard cases involving blocked drains or disputed responsibility for street maintenance, treating such matters with the same gravity as disputes over inheritance or grazing rights. A tenant might be immersed for failing to clean the gutter in front of his shop, the fine calibrated to the inconvenience caused to neighbors. Sumptuary laws in some regions touched indirectly on the problem, discouraging the overly long gowns that would drag through filth and spread contamination. Even religious processions adapted. Relics carried through the streets on feast days were held high, while the faithful who followed stepped carefully along the prepared route, mindful of both piety and practicality. The deeper we follow these streets, the more we notice how mud quietly constrained what people could reasonably achieve in a single day. A craftsman delivering finished cloth to a merchant across town might allocate extra time for the journey, knowing his packhorse could founder or his own boots grow leaden. A messenger carrying urgent letters from the king or a bishop would arrive mud-spattered and weary, his horse's flanks streaked, his own cloak hemmed in earth. The pace of administration itself slowed in winter and early spring, when even royal progresses were planned with an eye to the firmness of the roads. Yet this very limitation fostered a certain resilience and local knowledge. Villagers and townsfolk alike developed an intimate map of their surroundings measured not in miles but in the feel of the ground under different conditions, the safest crossing points after rain, the hollows that filled first and drained last. We have traced the mud from field to village lane to urban thoroughfare, watching how it shaped movement, labor, and small acts of civic care. Its influence reached still further, into the very garments people wore, the food they prepared, the ways they marked time and observed their faith. The same soft earth that slowed carts and stained shoes also supported the heavy plows that fed growing populations, and it preserved the evidence that lets us reconstruct their world with unexpected intimacy. The streets remain busy, the rain continues its quiet work, and the ground beneath every footstep waits to tell its next chapter. The streets remain busy, the rain continues its quiet work, and the ground beneath every footstep waits to tell its next chapter. That chapter reveals itself most clearly in the clothing that people reached for each morning, garments chosen not for elegance alone but for the quiet battle they would wage against the ever-present earth. In the countryside and the narrower town alleys alike will remain the universal fabric, thick and resilient, yet its very thickness became both ally and adversary once the mud took hold. A peasant's tunic or a townsman's hose, woven from local fleece, absorbed moisture readily. Once soaked and caked, the hem grew heavy, chafing against the skin with every stride and carrying the faint, earthy scent of the street long after the wearer had returned indoors. Those who could afford it layered their outer garments with linen undertunics that could be washed more frequently. But even linen, when dragged through the lanes, collected a fine silt that resisted ordinary rinsing and left faint brown stains that spoke of repeated journeys. Footwear told an even more revealing story. For the great majority, shoes or boots were made of sturdy but supple leather, often untanned or only lightly treated to keep costs low. These soles wore thin with astonishing speed when the mud was at its deepest, the constant suction pulling at seams until water seeped in and softened the leather further. Pattens, those raised wooden overshoes we glimpsed earlier, were more than a convenience. They were a calculated investment. A well-made pair might last 2 or 3 seasons if carefully maintained, their iron rings clinking against cobbles and leaving small, telltale impressions in the softer patches. Wealthier townsfolk commissioned patterns with decorative carving or bone inlays, turning necessity into a modest statement of status. Yet even these could sink if the underlying ground had turned to liquid after days of rain. In monastic accounts from places like Bury St. Edmunds or the great abbeys of the Low Countries, we find careful tallies of the cost of replacing worn patens for lay brothers whose daily rounds took them repeatedly between cloister and outer court, the mud claiming its toll on communal resources as surely as it did on individual patients. The daily labor of keeping clothes serviceable became its own quiet rhythm. In the evening, after the main work was done, families gathered near the hearth or a rushlight to scrape boots, brush tunics, and hang garments to dry in the smoky warmth. Mud that had dried to a crust could be beaten out with a wooden bat or a bundle of twigs, but the finer particles that had worked into the weave required more patient attention. Often a second scrubbing with lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat. Water itself was sometimes scarce or tainted, drawn from wells that stood perilously close to the very streets they served. So every drop used for cleaning represented a careful choice. Women, who bore much of this domestic maintenance, developed an intimate knowledge of which stains yielded to which remedies, passing techniques down through generations in the same way they passed recipes or prayers. The result was clothing that never looked entirely fresh to our modern eyes but carried the practical patina of lives lived in constant negotiation with the ground. This same negotiation extended into the preparation and storage of food, where mud's influence was subtler yet no less pervasive. Kitchens, whether the open hearth of a village cottage or the more elaborate setups in town houses, sat close to the earth. Floors of beaten earth or loose flagstones absorbed spills and tracked in dirt, and the constant traffic of feet coming in from the street or yard brought new layers of soil with each entry. Grain stored in sacks or bins had to be winnowed carefully before milling, lest grit from the fields or the market square find its way into the flour and wear down teeth over years of eating coarse bread. Vegetables pulled from garden plots carried their own coating of earth, rinsed in the same water that might have served for laundry the day before. Meat hanging in the larder or smoked in the chimney was shielded from flies but not from the dampness that rose from below, encouraging molds that households learned to trim away rather than discard entirely. Even ale and wine, staples of the medieval table, could be affected when barrels were rolled along muddy yards or when the brewer's yard itself became a quagmire, introducing stray particles that settled in the liquid and required straining before drinking. Yet the mud was never merely a source of inconvenience. In its own way, it supported the very systems that sustained daily life. The heavy, water-retentive soils of northern Europe, once turned by the moldboard plow, produced reliable yields of rye, barley, and oats that fed both people and livestock. The same dampness that complicated travel helped preserve hay in stacks and thatch on roofs, keeping roofs watertight through the worst of the autumn storms. In the fields, the slow, sucking progress of oxen pulling carts laden with manure actually enriched the soil for the following season, turning what felt like drudgery into an invisible cycle of renewal. People understood these connections instinctively, even if they rarely articulated them in writing. The mud was not an enemy to be defeated but a condition to be managed, much like the cold or the shortness of winter daylight. As we follow the paths further, we begin to see how this constant presence of soft ground threaded through the rhythms of faith and community observance. Churchyards, often the highest and best-drained land in a village or parish, became natural gathering points partly because they offered firmer footing for processions and burials. On feast days, the faithful made their way along lanes that had been at least partially cleared by the parish clerk or by communal effort, yet many still arrived with mud spattering their best cloaks, the scent of damp wool mingling with incense inside the nave. Pilgrims traveling to shrines such as Canterbury or Compostela planned their stages with an eye to the season, knowing that spring and autumn rains could double the time required for each day's march. Some carried spare wrappings for their feet or sought shelter in monasteries whose hospices kept stocks of dry straw for bedding and simple repairs to footwear. The very act of pilgrimage, so often described in spiritual terms, carried this practical undercurrent of endurance against the earth itself, each mile a reminder that devotion and discomfort were rarely far apart. In larger towns, the cathedrals and collegiate churches sometimes maintained short stretches of paved approach, funded by pious donations or guild bequests, where the faithful could pause and gather themselves before entering sacred space. Even there, however, the surrounding precincts remained vulnerable. During the great processions of Corpus Christi or the local Saint's Day, the streets leading to the church would fill with spectators and participants alike, their combined weight churning the surface anew. Civic records from places like Norwich or Florence note occasional disputes over who was responsible for clearing the route beforehand, the cost of labor and materials carefully accounted for in the town rolls. These small acts of preparation reveal a shared understanding that the ground beneath their feet was part of the communal fabric, something to be tended collectively even when resources were tight. The deeper we look into the 14th century, the more we notice how the mud's quiet persistence intersected with larger shifts already stirring across Europe. Populations had grown steadily through the High Middle Ages, pressing harder on the available land and intensifying the use of marginal soils that drained even more poorly. In some regions, this led to the expansion of ridge and furrow systems designed to shed water more effectively, creating the corrugated patterns still visible from the air in certain English and French landscapes today. Yet the increased traffic of people and goods along the same old tracks only deepened the ruts and widened the areas of churned earth. Merchants from the Hanseatic League or Italian banking houses, arriving in northern ports after sea voyages, stepped ashore to find that the final leg of their journey inland could be the most arduous, their fine Venetian shoes or Florentine hose quickly surrendering to the local conditions. Letters preserved in merchant archives occasionally mention the extra expense of hiring local guides, who knew the safest paths, or the cost of replacing pack animals that had strained a tendon in the mire. This growing pressure on the land and its pathways would soon meet one of the most dramatic interruptions in medieval history. But before we turn toward those years of upheaval, it is worth pausing over the smaller, more intimate ways the mud continued to shape private and public life. In the scriptoria of monasteries, monks copying manuscripts by candlelight might glance occasionally toward the cloister garth, where rain had once again softened the paths between buildings, reminding them that even the pursuit of learning rested upon the same yielding earth that supported the abbey's farms and granges. In noble households, ladies and their attendants embroidered borders on garments with patterns that echoed the winding lanes and field boundaries they knew so well, turning the geography of their daily walks into something ornamental. The mud, in its patient way, left its mark on imagination as well as on the body. We have followed its influence from the open fields through town streets and into the textures of clothing, food, and faith. Its presence lingers still in the records of daily administration, in the seasonal rhythms of trade, and in the quiet resilience required simply to move from one task to the next. As the calendar pages turn toward the middle decades of the 14th century, the same soft ground that had long ordered ordinary existence would soon bear witness to changes far larger than any single footstep, changes that would test the adaptability of every community living close to the earth. The rain continues to fall, the streets remain busy, and the next layer of this story waits just ahead, where the paths grow slightly steeper and the mud, for a time, grows deeper still. The rain continues to fall, the streets remain busy, and the next layer of this story waits just ahead, where the paths grow slightly steeper and the mud, for a time, grows deeper still. In the opening decades of the 14th century, the climate itself began to shift in ways that medieval people could feel in their bones and see in the ground beneath their feet. What historians now describe as the early stirrings of the Little Ice Age brought cooler summers and wetter autumns across much of northern Europe, turning the already heavy soils into something even more unyielding. Rain that once fell in gentle patterns now lingered, swelling rivers and softening every track until the familiar sucking resistance of mud became a deeper, more exhausting pull. Fields that had reliably yielded rye and barley for generations now lay waterlogged for weeks, their furrows filling with standing pools that refused to drain. The same paths villagers had walked for centuries to reach their scattered strips of land grew treacherous in ways that tested the limits of daily endurance. The Great Famine that settled over much of Europe between 1315 and 1317 made these conditions painfully immediate. Poor harvests were not unknown, but the scale of failure that year felt different, compounded by the very earth that refused to release its excess water. Oxen struggled to drag plows through the saturated clay, their hooves sinking past the fetlocks and slowing the work until daylight faded. Carts laden with what little seed grain could be spared often bogged down before they reached the sowing strips, requiring entire families to wade in and push, their legs caked to the knees by the time the task was finished. Those who still had strength to travel in search of food found the roads between villages transformed into ribbons of slurry that swallowed wheels and exhausted horses. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in the shelter of monastic scriptoria, noted with quiet resignation how travelers arrived half-drowned in mud, their bundles of belongings sodden and heavy, carrying stories of villages where the dead lay unburied because the ground itself was too soft to dig a proper grave. Yet even in the midst of such hardship the daily round continued. Someone still had to fetch water from the well, someone still had to drive the remaining livestock along the lane to whatever pasture remained unflooded, and the mud accepted each footstep without distinction between the starving and the merely inconvenienced. By the time the famine eased, the memory of those years had settled into the collective experience much like the silt it left behind. Paths that had once been repaired with brushwood now required more labor simply to remain passable, and some marginal tracks were quietly abandoned as communities drew closer together for mutual support. The population, already pressed by earlier growth, had been thinned but not broken, and the land bore new scars. In the towns, the streets told a similar tale. The kennels that ran down the center of market squares overflowed more readily now, carrying not only the usual refuse but the residue of desperation. Discarded scraps from meager meals, the leavings of animals slaughtered early to save fodder, the occasional body of a traveler who had collapsed at the gate. Civic authorities responded with the same measured ordinances we saw earlier, yet enforcement grew stricter in places where public health felt newly fragile. Scavengers worked longer hours, and fines for fouling the ways were collected with greater diligence. Not because the mud had become worse in principle, but because its consequences now felt more immediate to a society that had glimpsed how quickly order could erode. Then, in the late summer of 1347, another force arrived that would intersect with the mud in ways no one could have anticipated. The plague, carried along trade routes from the east, reached the ports of Sicily and spread northward with devastating speed. As it moved through the muddy lanes of Europe, the ground that had always slowed movement now became part of the crisis itself. Ships docked at London or Bordeaux, their crews already showing signs of illness, and the carters who unloaded bales of cloth or barrels of wine stepped ashore into the familiar quagmire of the wharves, unknowingly carrying fleas in the folds of their clothing and the crevices of their wooden pattens. In the countryside, the same tracks that had borne seed and harvest now carried the sick from one hamlet to another in desperate searches for help or, later, in flight. Parish priests trudged through rain-soaked churchyards to administer last rites, their robes dragging in earth that was now being turned repeatedly for hasty burials. The mud, once merely inconvenient, became a medium that held and concealed the evidence of loss. Shallow graves softened by rain sometimes shifted, and the constant passage of the living kept the surface disturbed long after the immediate danger had passed. What strikes us in the surviving accounts is how ordinary routines persisted even as the world seemed to unravel. A miller in a village near Toulouse might still rise before dawn to check the sluice gate, his clogs sinking into the yard that had become a small lake of silt and chaff, while inside the mill house his family tended the few survivors among them. In Florence or Ghent, Merchants who had lost entire households continued to negotiate what trade remained possible, lifting their muddied boots onto the benches of guild halls to keep the worst of the filth from the floorboards. The very act of walking through the afflicted streets required a new kind of vigilance. People avoided the deeper puddles not only for fear of ruinous shoes, but because standing water now carried an unspoken dread. Yet, the practical adaptations that had always existed proved surprisingly durable. Pattens were still slipped on at doorways, garments were still scraped and brushed by firelight, and the communal effort to keep a section of lane clear continued, sometimes performed by fewer hands but with the same quiet determination. The plague did not erase the mud. In many places it made its presence more noticeable, as labor shortages left ditches uncleared and roads unrepaired for longer stretches than anyone could remember. When the worst waves subsided by the early 1350s, the landscape of daily life had been altered in ways both visible and invisible. Fewer people meant fewer feet churning the same paths, yet the reduced workforce also meant less capacity to maintain them. In some regions, lords found themselves unable to enforce the old labor services for road repairs, and the three-field system began to show signs of strain where entire tenements lay vacant. The mud, however, remained patient and unchanged. In the years that followed, survivors and newcomers alike stepped back onto the same tracks, noticing perhaps that certain hollows had deepened or that a once familiar ford now required a wider detour. The ground itself seemed to hold the memory of the crisis, its surface compacted in places by the hurried passage of carts carrying the dead or the desperate. Yet life resumed its rhythm. Markets reopened, though on a smaller scale at first, and the seasonal cycle of plowing and harvest returned, the oxen once again pulling against the resistant earth with the same steady, uncomplaining strength. As the second half of the 14th century unfolded, these post-plague realities began to reshape the relationship between people and the soft ground they walked upon. Wages for laborers rose in many areas because hands were scarce, allowing some peasants and artisans to invest in better footwear or even the occasional stone threshold for their cottages. In towns, the civic pride that had once funded cobbling now sometimes extended to more ambitious drainage projects, funded by the increased revenues from vacant properties or new taxes. Yet these improvements were never uniform. The countryside, where most still lived, saw slower change. A tract that had served a thriving village might now lie half-forgotten between abandoned holdings, its ruts softened by unchecked vegetation and seasonal flooding. Travelers crossing from one region to another remarked on the contrast, how some manors appeared almost neatly kept while neighboring ones showed the quiet reclamation of the earth. The mud had always been democratic. Now it reflected the uneven recovery of a society learning to live with fewer souls and greater expectations. We begin to sense, too, how these altered conditions influenced the small economies of daily movement. A carter delivering wool to a clothier in the next town might find the journey lighter on some days, simply because fewer competitors crowded the road. Yet the surface itself could be more unpredictable where maintenance had lapsed. Women carrying produce to market learned new shortcuts across fields that had fallen out of cultivation, their pattens leaving prints in soil that had not been trodden for seasons. The very pace of news and administration adjusted once more. Royal messengers still arrived mud-spattered, but the letters they carried sometimes spoke of new laws designed to stabilize a world that had been upended. In the scriptoria and the counting houses, scribes continued to record the ordinary transactions of life, noting the cost of a new pair of boots or the labor required to clear a flooded lane, treating these entries with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for any other expense. The paths, though changed, still led onward. As we follow them deeper into the later decades of the century, we will see how the mud continued to shape the world that emerged from crisis, influencing the rise of new social tensions, the rhythms of seasonal labor, and the quiet innovations that people devised to make their daily journeys a little less burdensome. The rain still falls, the ground still yields, and the story of those who walked through it keeps unfolding, one careful step at a time, into the changing landscape of late medieval Europe. The rain still falls, the ground still yields, and the story of those who walked through it keeps unfolding, one careful step at a time, into the changing landscape of late medieval Europe. In the decades after the plague's worst ravages, the same soft earth that had witnessed so much loss now bore the weight of a society rebuilding itself under new pressures and new possibilities. Labor shortages meant that many who survived found their daily obligations lighter in some respects, yet the mud itself refused to ease its claim. Lords who once commanded teams of villagers for road maintenance now struggled to assemble enough hands, and the familiar lanes between manor and field began to show the effects of neglect in deeper ruts and wider spreads of standing water. A tenant farmer in the English Midlands or the French countryside might walk the same path to his allotted strips that his father had trodden, but now he did so with a stronger bargaining position. The mud that clung to his boots became, in its quiet way, part of the leverage he carried when negotiating better terms with an overlord desperate for workers. These shifts found their most visible expression in the seasonal rhythms of labor that had always been dictated by the ground. Plowing in early spring, once a communal effort of oxen and shared teams, often fell to smaller groups or even solitary men with lighter horses that could move more nimbly through the softened soil. The moldboard plow still turned the heavy clay, but the furrows it left filled more readily with rainwater, requiring extra days of waiting before sowing could begin. Harvest time brought its own familiar struggle. Reapers moving through wet fields found their sickles heavier with mud splashed onto the blades, and the sheaves they bound carried extra weight that slowed the carts on the return journey to the barn. Women and children who followed behind to glean what remained worked with skirts hitched high and bare feet or simple clogs sinking inches deep, their movements careful and repetitive in the same way their ancestors had known. Yet the post-plague years introduced a subtle difference. With fewer mouths to feed, some families could afford to leave marginal strips fallow longer, allowing the earth a chance to firm, while others experimented with new crops or rotations that might drain better in the cooler, wetter climate. The mud remained the constant, but the hands that negotiated it now moved with a touch more autonomy. In the towns, the story took on a different texture. Civic authorities, flush with revenues from escheat properties or increased trade in certain goods, began to invest more deliberately in the streets that linked market squares to the gates. Records from places like Bristol or Strasbourg show modest sums allocated for gravel carted in from nearby pits or for the occasional laying of wooden planks across the worst sections near the riverfronts. These were not grand engineering projects, but practical responses to the reality that cleaner passage meant faster commerce and fewer complaints from merchants whose carts arrived caked and delayed. The guilds that once focused on regulating quality now sometimes turned their attention to the practicalities of movement, requiring members to contribute labor or materials for maintaining the approaches to their halls. A weaver or a tanner stepping out each morning still slipped on his pattens, but he might notice that the central channel of his street ran a little clearer after a rain, the scavenger's barrow having made its rounds with greater regularity. Even so, the side alleys and the residential quarters behind the main thoroughfares stayed much as they had always been, soft underfoot and demanding the same patient lifting of feet that had marked urban life for generations. Social tensions simmered beneath these surface adjustments, and the mud played its part in ways that chroniclers rarely spelled out, but that court rolls and petitions make clear. The great revolts of the late 14th century, from the English peasants' rising of 1381 to the Jacquerie echoes still felt in parts of France, drew much of their fuel from resentment over labor services and taxes. Yet for many participants the immediate grievances were grounded quite literally in the earth. The demand to repair roads and ditches without adequate reward, the frustration of walking miles through mire to perform boon work on the Lord's domain while their own plots lay neglected. A petition from a village in Kent or Picardy might complain not in grand terms of liberty, but in the practical language of blocked drains and impassable lanes that made every task heavier than it needed to be. The march toward London or Paris by those who rose up carried the same muddy imprint. Boots and bare feet left trails that mingled with the dust of summer roads, a visible reminder that the burden of the land fell unevenly. When the revolts were suppressed, the old obligations returned in modified form, but the memory of those collective steps lingered, shaping quieter negotiations in manor courts for years afterward. Quiet innovations emerged from these very pressures, born not from grand theory but from the daily necessity of moving through the world. In some lowland regions, the use of broader, flatter wooden sawls on pattens became more common, distributing weight more evenly so that a man could cross softer ground without sinking as deeply. In the Low Countries and parts of eastern England, villagers began laying more systematic bundles of brushwood and faggots along key tracks, creating rudimentary corduroy surfaces that lasted a season or two before needing renewal. These were small, local solutions, often organized by the parish or the manor rather than by distant authority, and they reflected a practical ingenuity honed over lifetimes of dealing with the same yielding earth. A carter might equip his wagon with wider wheels or add a second pair of oxen for the worst stretches, calculating the extra cost against the time saved on muddy days. Women in market towns experimented with shorter hemlines or reinforced overskirts that could be detached and cleaned more easily, turning a necessity into a modest adaptation that slowly influenced local fashions. These changes were never dramatic enough to eliminate the mud, but they softened its daily toll, allowing people to carry on with the business of living in a world that felt both emptier and somehow more their own. As the calendar moved into the 1390s and the early years of the 15th century, these adaptations settled into the texture of ordinary existence. The climate continued its cooler, damper trend, and the ground responded accordingly. Yet the reduced population meant that the pressure on marginal lands eased in many places. Fields that had once been pushed to their limits now lay under grass or light scrub in some regions, their former tracks slowly softening back into the landscape. Travelers crossing from one county to another or from town to countryside still encountered the familiar resistance underfoot, but they also noticed pockets of improvement where local initiative had taken hold. A monk journeying between monasteries might record in his journal the relative firmness of certain abbey-maintained causeways, contrasting them with the general condition of the king's highway. The mud remained a faithful companion, shaping the pace at which news traveled, goods moved, and neighbors visited one another, but it did so within a society that had learned, through crisis and recovery, to meet it with a slightly more deliberate hand. We can picture, then, a typical morning in the year 1405 in a market town somewhere in the English shires or the German lands. The bells call for prime, and the streets begin to stir. A baker's apprentice hurries along the kennel with his tray of loaves, his pattens leaving neat impressions in the overnight softening. A wool merchant pauses at his doorway to adjust his cloak, glancing at the sky to judge whether today's journey to the next fair will be slowed by fresh rain. In the surrounding fields, a plowman urges his team forward, the animals leaning into the traces as the blade slices through soil that yields more readily than it did a generation earlier yet still demands respect. The daily negotiation continues, unchanged in its fundamentals yet inflected by the lessons of the recent past. The ground beneath every footstep still holds its quiet authority, reminding those who walk upon it that time moves slowly when the earth itself resists. The paths that had carried so much through plague and famine now stretched onward into a century that would bring its own upheavals, from the dynastic struggles of the Wars of the Roses to the steady expansion of trade and the first stirrings of new ideas about land and labor. The mud would witness all of it, absorbing the tread of soldiers and merchants, pilgrims and rebels, in the same uncomplaining way it always had. As we follow those footsteps further, we will see how the familiar resistance of the earth intersected with these larger currents, shaping the pace of change and the texture of daily resilience in ways that few records bother to note but that remain etched into the very soil of late medieval Europe. The rain still falls gently in the background, the lanes wait patiently ahead, and the story of those who walked them keeps drawing us deeper into the lived realities of a world built close to the ground. The rain still falls gently in the background, the lanes wait patiently ahead, and the story of those who walked them keeps drawing us deeper into the lived realities of a world built close to the ground. As the 15th century unfolded, those same lanes began to carry the tread of new conflicts and new ambitions. Yet the mud remained an unchanging companion, shaping the pace of armies and merchants alike in ways that few chroniclers paused to detail. The dynastic struggles that would later be remembered as the Wars of the Roses in England turned the countryside into a landscape of cautious movement, where mounted knights and foot soldiers alike found their progress slowed by the familiar resistance underfoot. A royal army marching north from London in the wet springs of the 1450s might cover only half the expected distance on a given day, the horses' hooves sinking into ruts deepened by earlier rains, the wagons of supplies creaking and tilting as wheels fought for purchase. Soldiers learned to wrap their boots in extra rags or to carry spare saws, knowing that a single bogged-down column could mean the difference between reaching a defensible position before nightfall and camping in the open with damp feet and lowered spirits. The mud did not choose sides. It simply demanded its toll from every marcher, turning what might have been a swift campaign into a series of deliberate, exhausting stages. In the towns that lay along these routes, the effects rippled outward. A market square in Coventry or York, already accustomed to the churn of daily trade, would see its surface transformed anew when troops passed through, the press of boots and hooves mixing with the usual refuse until the ground became a slick, uneven expanse that required extra labor from the town's scavengers the following morning. Civic leaders, mindful of both public order and the need to keep commerce flowing, sometimes issued hasty orders for gravel to be spread along the main approaches. Yet these measures were temporary at best. Merchants whose carts had been delayed by the military traffic grumbled over lost profits, while local artisans found unexpected work repairing damaged footwear or selling bundles of faggots to those who could afford a firmer crossing. Even in times of relative peace, the shadow of conflict lingered in the practical preparations. Villagers along the main highways kept stores of brushwood ready, knowing that a sudden summons from the Lord could send them out to lay temporary surfaces for passing forces. The mud, in this way, became part of the quiet infrastructure of power, slowing the ambitions of kings and nobles while reminding everyone that the land itself held veto power over grand designs. Further afield, across the Channel in the territories contested during the final phases of the 100 Years' War, the same soft earth imposed its own rhythm on siege and retreat. French and English chroniclers alike noted, often in passing, how artillery trains and supply lines foundered in the low-lying plains of Normandy or the Ile-de-France after autumn rains. Cannon barrels, laboriously dragged on wooden sledges, sank axle-deep in places where the ground had once supported lighter carts, requiring teams of oxen and men to heave them free while archers stood watch in the drizzle. For the common soldiers and camp followers who trudged alongside, the daily march meant negotiating not only enemy positions but the very terrain that had changed little since the days of their grandparents. A laundress carrying bundles of linen for the camp would lift her skirts higher than usual, her wooden pattens leaving deep impressions that filled with water behind her. The mud preserved these moments in its own way, sealing footprints and discarded fragments into layers that archaeologists would one day uncover beneath modern farmland. Small testimonies to lives lived in the shadow of larger events. Yet away from the battle lines, the quieter currents of trade continued their slow, persistent flow. The wool and cloth routes that linked the English Midlands to the ports of the Low Countries still depended on the same muddy tracks that had served for centuries, though the volume of goods had begun to shift with changing markets. A pack train leaving a Yorkshire village might set out before dawn, the lead horse's hooves testing the firmness of the lane after overnight rain, the drovers walking beside with staffs to steady the animals through the deeper patches. In the bustling entrepôts of Bruges or Antwerp, the streets leading to the quays had seen incremental improvements. More frequent laying of cobblestones funded by merchant guilds eager to protect their investments. But even these surfaces gave way at the edges to the familiar slurry where rainwater pooled and refuse accumulated. Foreign traders stepping ashore from Italian or Hanseatic ships quickly learned to adopt local customs, purchasing patents from dockside vendors and adjusting their stride to the rhythm of the ground. Letters preserved in merchant ledgers occasionally mention the extra days added to journeys because of foul ways. The phrase carrying the same resigned practicality we have heard before, as though the mud were simply one more cost of doing business. These patterns of movement influenced the small economies of the household in ways that echoed earlier centuries yet carried the subtle marks of a changing age. In a prosperous peasant, holding the extra coin earned from higher wages might go toward a second pair of sturdier boots or a set of iron-reinforced pattens that could withstand the heavier traffic of a post-plague world. Women in the village or the town's outer wards continued the evening ritual of cleaning garments, now perhaps with slightly better lye soap traded from urban markets, scraping away the day's accumulation while children played nearby with miniature wooden clogs of their own. The hearth fire, once the center of drying and repair, still served that purpose, but the fuel itself, peat or wood gathered from increasingly managed woodlands, reflected a land where resources were being husbanded more carefully after the great thinning of population. Food preparation carried the same careful awareness of the earth. Grain winnowed on barn floors that themselves rested on beaten soil had to be watched for the fine grit that rain could carry indoors on boots, and the ale brewed in the brewhouse next to the muddy yard was strained through cloth to catch whatever the ground had contributed during the rolling of barrels. As the century progressed into its middle decades, these daily accommodations began to intersect with the first faint stirrings of broader transformation. In some regions, the growth of enclosed fields and the gradual shift away from the old open field system meant that certain tracts fell out of heavy use, allowing the earth to recover its firmness in places while others, nearer to expanding market towns, bore an increasing burden. Civic authorities in places like London or Paris renewed efforts to regulate the streets, issuing ordinances that required householders to pave their frontages with stone or tile, the cost sometimes offset by rising rents in a recovering economy. These were still patchwork solutions, leaving the majority of lanes and rural paths much as they had always been, yet they signaled a growing recognition that cleaner movement could support the kind of commerce and administration that ambitious rulers sought to cultivate. A traveler in the 1460s might notice, with quiet satisfaction, a newly graveled stretch outside a guild hall or a monastery gate, only to find the improvement end abruptly at the town boundary where the old mire resumed its claim. The ground continued to preserve its own quiet record of these years. In waterlogged deposits beneath town cellars and along abandoned trackways, layers of silt trapped leather scraps, broken pattens, and the occasional lost button or coin, each artifact bearing the imprint of a specific gate or a particular season's reign. Monastic chroniclers and town clerks, copying their accounts by candlelight, might include a passing note about the cost of clearing a flooded lane or the delay of a shipment, treating the mud as an unremarkable fact of existence rather than a subject worthy of lament. Yet for those who lived it, the reality was intimate and constant. The ache in the calves after a long day's walk, the faint squelch that accompanied every step on market day, the small relief of reaching a threshold where one could finally scrape the worst away and step inside to dry warmth. These sensations bound generations together across the changing political landscape, a shared vocabulary of the body that no royal proclamation or guild statute could fully erase. We can picture, then, a late autumn afternoon in 1475 somewhere along a lane in the English countryside or the Flemish hinterland. The light is fading, and a small party of traders makes its way homeward, their horses stepping carefully through the softened earth, the riders' cloaks darkened at the hems where the mud has climbed. In the distance, the church tower rises above the village, its yard offering the promise of firmer ground for the final approach. The day's business has been concluded, yet the journey itself has been the greater part of the story, measured not in miles but in the steady resistance of the path beneath every hoof and boot. The rain, which has eased for now, will return soon enough, and the lanes will wait once more to receive whatever footsteps the coming years bring. The world is shifting in ways both gradual and profound, but the ground remains close, patient, and ever-present, ready to shape the next chapter of lives lived in constant, quiet conversation with the earth. The world is shifting in ways both gradual and profound, but the ground remains close, patient, and ever-present, ready to shape the next chapter of lives lived in constant, quiet conversation with the earth. By the closing decades of the 15th century and the opening years of the 16th, that conversation had taken on new inflections as the rhythms of trade and governance quickened in certain corners of Europe while the mud beneath ordinary feet stayed stubbornly unchanged. In the prosperous trading cities of the Hanseatic League or the growing ports of the Atlantic seaboard, merchants whose ledgers now recorded shipments of spices and printed books still stepped from their doorways into streets that demanded the same familiar adjustments. A clerk hurrying to the customs house with a bundle of invoices might wear finer hose than his grandfather, yet he still carried patens in a leather satchel, slipping them on before crossing the market square where the cobbles gave way to softer ground near the warehouses. The increased volume of carts and pack animals only pressed the earth harder, widening the ruts and deepening the channels that carried rainwater and refuse toward the river, so that even on drier days the surface retained a faint give under each step. In the countryside the pattern held with equal persistence. Enclosures in parts of England and the Low Countries were beginning to reshape the open fields into more compact holdings. Yet the lanes connecting them to the village or the nearest market town remained the same soft tracks worn by generations. A yeoman farmer driving a small flock of sheep to pasture would guide them along the familiar path, his boots sinking just as his father's had, the animal's hooves churning the surface into a slick paste that clung to everything it touched. The introduction of new crops like hops or the expanded cultivation of flax for linen brought extra traffic during certain seasons, and the wagons hauling these goods found themselves bogged down in the same hollows that had troubled travelers for centuries. Local manorial courts continued to hear disputes over the maintenance of these ways, fining tenants who failed to clear ditches or lay fresh faggots, the language of the rolls echoing the practical concerns of earlier generations even as the broader economy began to tilt toward greater specialization. Monasteries and religious houses, long accustomed to managing their own estates, faced these conditions with the same measured pragmatism. The great abbeys of Yorkshire or Burgundy kept detailed accounts of the labor spent on road repairs within their granges, noting the cost of timber for corduroy sections or the wages paid to lay brothers who cleared mud from the cloister walks after heavy rain. Pilgrims arriving at shrines such as Walsingham or Santiago still planned their journeys with the season in mind, knowing that spring thaws or autumn downpours could turn a week's pilgrimage into 10 days of careful progress. Some carried letters of introduction that mentioned the need for dry lodging, while others relied on the hospitality of wayside inns whose yards were perpetually churned by arriving horses and departing carts. The mud here took on a faintly devotional quality. Those who completed their journeys often spoke quietly of the endurance required, as though the very resistance of the earth had tested and refined their faith in ways that smoother roads never could. Urban authorities, meanwhile, responded to the slow but steady growth of populations in certain towns by experimenting with more systematic street improvements. In places like Nuremberg or Lyon, town councils allocated funds for the regular collection of night soil and the spreading of gravel on key thoroughfares, creating short stretches where the footing felt noticeably firmer under pattens or leather soles. These efforts were never universal. The side streets and the areas beyond the walls stayed much as they had always been, and a sudden rain could still undo weeks of work in a single afternoon. Householders continued their daily ritual of sweeping the section before their doors, while guilds sometimes organized collective cleanings before major fairs or festivals. A visitor from a more rural district might remark on the relative order of a well-managed town square, yet even there the scent of damp earth and organic matter lingered in the air, a reminder that the ground itself had not been tamed, only negotiated with greater attention. The daily lives of women and children continued to weave themselves around these same realities in ways both intimate and communal. A mother carrying water from the village well or the town conduit would balance her buckets on a yoke, her skirts hitched high and her clogs tested against the softest patches to avoid spilling. Children learning to walk did so on beaten earth floors that tracked in the outside world with every entry, their small feet quickly darkening with the same silt that marked their parents' steps. In the evenings, the task of cleaning footwear and garments remained a shared labor, performed by the light of rush or candle while stories were told or prayers recited. The mud that clung to hems and soles carried traces of the fields or the street, and the act of removing it became a quiet punctuation to the day, a small restoration of order before sleep claimed the household. These routines, repeated across countless cottages and town houses, bound families to the land in a manner that no map or chronicle could fully capture. As the 16th century dawned, the ground beneath these ordinary journeys began to witness the first ripples of transformations that would eventually reach far beyond the lanes and market squares. The spread of printed books and the circulation of news through merchant networks moved along the same muddy routes that had carried manuscripts and oral reports for centuries. Yet now the volume of information increased while the pace of its delivery remained governed by the weather and the state of the paths. A courier carrying the latest broadsheet from a printing house in Mainz or Antwerp would still arrive at his destination with boots caked and cloak hemmed in earth, the documents inside his satchel kept dry only by careful wrapping. In the countryside, the gradual adoption of new agricultural techniques, such as better drainage ditches in some regions, offered modest relief in certain fields, yet the connecting lanes often lagged behind, their surfaces still yielding to every footfall and wheel. The mud, ever patient, absorbed these changes without hurry, preserving in its layers the small artifacts of daily movement. A lost button from a merchant's coat, a fragment of printed paper blown from a careless hand, the impression of a child's wooden clog pressed into the silt after a sudden shower. We can imagine, then, an early spring morning in 1510 somewhere along a well-traveled lane in the Rhineland or the English home counties. The air is cool and damp, and a small group of travelers sets out from an inn whose yard is already softening under the night's rain. A merchant bound for the next fair adjusts his pattens with practiced ease, while behind him a servant leads a packhorse whose hooves sink inches deep with each step. In the nearby village, the blacksmith is already at work, his apron darkened at the hem where he has crossed the muddy forge yard to fetch tools. The church bell rings for prime, and the faithful make their way along the churchyard path, lifting their feet with the same quiet care that has marked every generation before them. The world beyond the horizon is stirring with new ideas and new ambitions. Yet here, on the ground that supports every step, the old conversation continues unchanged. The lanes stretch onward, the rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits to receive whatever footsteps the coming decades bring, ready as always to shape the texture of lives lived close to its yielding surface. The earth waits to receive whatever footsteps the coming decades bring, ready as always to shape the texture of lives lived close to its yielding surface. That yielding surface continued to greet the footsteps of ordinary men, women, and children as the 16th century gathered momentum, even as new currents of religious reform and political ambition began to stir across the continent. In the years following the posting of Luther's theses in Wittenberg, the same muddy lanes that had carried pilgrims and merchants now bore the tread of itinerant preachers and couriers carrying printed pamphlets. A humble cleric traveling from a small town in Saxony to a neighboring parish might set out at dawn with a satchel of freshly printed broadsheets tucked beneath his cloak, his wooden pattens clacking against any firmer patches while the softer sections pulled at his steps with the familiar reluctance. The spread of ideas depended, in the end, on the same practical realities that had governed movement for centuries. A flooded ford could delay a crucial message by days, and a cart loaded with bound copies of the New German Bible might founder in a lane turned liquid by spring rains, requiring the preacher and his companions to wade in and free the wheels while the documents remained carefully wrapped against the damp. In the English countryside under the Tudors, the pattern held with equal persistence. The dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s and 1540s shifted ownership of vast estates, yet the tracks linking the newly acquired lands to market towns remained the same soft ribbons of earth. A former abbey tenant now working for a gentleman farmer would still rise before light to walk the familiar path to the fields, his boots sinking into soil that had been trodden by generations of monastic laborers before him. The enclosures that accelerated in certain regions created new hedges and boundaries, but the connecting lanes between villages often grew busier rather than quieter, as wool production expanded and carts heavy with fleece or finished cloth pressed deeper ruts into the ground. Women carrying eggs or butter to the weekly market learned to judge the safest line across each hollow, their skirts lifted and their pattens worn smooth from repeated use. The mud here took on an added layer of quiet tension. Petitions to the crown sometimes complained of neglected roads where former monastic responsibilities for maintenance had lapsed, leaving communities to shoulder the burden themselves through parish levies or informal labor. Urban centers, swelling with new populations drawn by trade and administration, responded with incremental attempts at order that still could not banish the earth entirely. In London, the streets around the Inns of Court or the growing wharves saw more frequent gravelling funded by guild subscriptions, yet the alleys behind the main thoroughfares and the areas beyond the city walls stayed stubbornly soft. A lawyer hurrying to Westminster with briefs under his arm might wear finer leather shoes than his rural counterparts, but he still kept a pair of pattens ready at his lodgings, knowing that a single detour through an uncleared kennel could ruin both footwear and schedule. Householders continued their morning sweeps, while the scavengers employed by the corporation pushed their barrows along the central channels with greater frequency, especially before major court sessions or royal progresses. Even so, after any prolonged rain, the market squares in places like Norwich or Bristol would transform once more into a mosaic of slick stone and yielding channels, where buyers and sellers negotiated prices while standing calf-deep in the mixture that had defined urban life for so long. The daily domestic world remained anchored to these same conditions in ways both practical and deeply felt. In a yeoman's farmhouse in the Midlands or a craftsman's dwelling in a Flemish town, the evening ritual of cleaning boots and garments persisted by the light of tallow candles or rushlights. Children, now perhaps learning their letters from a newly available primer, still tracked mud across the beaten earth floor upon returning from errands, their small footprints mingling with those of adults in a pattern repeated across countless households. Food preparation carried the same careful awareness. Grain stored in lofts above the stable yard had to be sifted for the fine grit that rain could carry indoors, and the ale brewed in the yard next to the muddy lane was strained through linen to remove whatever the ground had contributed during the rolling of barrels. The mud that clung to hems and sawls was no longer merely an inconvenience. In an age of heightened religious scrutiny, it sometimes carried symbolic weight as well, preachers drawing quiet analogies between the stains of the world and the need for spiritual cleansing, even as the physical reality remained unchanged. Military and administrative movements in the mid-16th century brought these realities into sharper relief during moments of crisis. The campaigns of the Italian wars or the English expeditions to Scotland and France saw armies contending with the same soft ground that had slowed their predecessors. Supply trains laden with powder and shot moved at the deliberate pace dictated by the season, horses straining against traces while soldiers marched with rags wrapped around their boots to gain what little purchase they could. Messengers carrying urgent dispatches from the court in Madrid or Paris arrived at their destinations mud-spattered and weary, their reports sometimes noting the extra days lost to impassable tracks rather than enemy action. In the countryside, the passage of troops left temporary scars, widened ruts, trampled verges, and the occasional abandoned wagon half sunk in a hollow. Local communities, called upon to provide labor or fodder, found their own daily journeys complicated by these disruptions. Yet the underlying negotiation with the earth continued without pause once the soldiers had moved on. As the century advanced toward its middle decades, population growth began to reverse some of the post-plague easing of pressure on the land. More feet and more wheels meant busier lanes in many regions, and the familiar resistance underfoot grew more noticeable during peak seasons of sowing and harvest. In parts of the Low Countries and northern France, where drainage projects had long been a matter of communal survival, Villagers expanded earlier experiments with raised causeways and wooden walkways, creating short stretches that offered a firmer tread for those willing to pay a small toll or contribute labor. These innovations were practical and localized, never grand enough to suggest that the mud had been conquered, but they spoke of a society that continued to adapt while accepting the ground's authority. A merchant traveling from Antwerp to Ghent in the 1550s might note with quiet satisfaction the improved sections near the major canals, yet he would still adjust his stride once the improved road gave way to the ordinary lane beyond what we can picture. Then, a late summer afternoon in 1565 somewhere along a well-traveled track in the English West Country or the German Rhineland. The harvest is nearing its close, and a line of reapers makes its way homeward, sickles resting on shoulders, their boots and clogs heavy with the day's accumulated earth. A small cart follows behind, its wheels leaving fresh impressions in the softened surface as it carries the last sheaves toward the barn. In the distance, the village church stands steady against the sky, his boots sinking into soil that had been trodden by generations of monastic laborers before him. The enclosures that accelerated in certain regions created new hedges and boundaries, but the connecting lanes between villages often grew busier rather than quieter. As wool production expanded and carts heavy with fleece or finished cloth pressed deeper ruts into the ground. Women carrying eggs or butter to the weekly market learned to judge the safest line across each hollow, their skirts lifted and their pattens worn smooth from repeated use. The mud here took on an added layer of quiet tension. Petitions to the crown sometimes complained of neglected roads where former monastic responsibilities for maintenance had lapsed, leaving communities to shoulder the burden themselves through parish levies or informal labor. Urban centers, swelling with new populations drawn by trade and administration, responded with incremental attempts at order that still could not banish the earth entirely. In London, the streets around the Inns of Court or the growing wharves saw more frequent gravelling funded by guild subscriptions, yet the alleys behind the main thoroughfares and the areas beyond the city walls stayed stubbornly soft. A lawyer hurrying to Westminster with briefs under his arm might wear finer leather shoes than his rural counterparts, but he still kept a pair of pattens ready at his lodgings, knowing that a single detour through an uncleared kennel could ruin both footwear and schedule. Householders continued their morning sweeps, while the scavengers employed by the corporation pushed their barrows along the central channels with greater frequency, especially before major court sessions or royal progresses. Even so, after any prolonged rain, the market squares in places like Norwich or Bristol would transform once more into a mosaic of slick stone and yielding channels, where buyers and sellers negotiated prices while standing calf-deep in the mixture that had defined urban life for so long. The daily domestic world remained anchored to these same conditions in ways both practical and deeply felt. In a yeoman's farmhouse in the Midlands or a craftsman's dwelling in a Flemish town, the evening ritual of cleaning boots and garments persisted by the light of tallow candles or rushlights. Children, now perhaps learning their letters from a newly available primer, still tracked mud across the beaten earth floor upon returning from errands, their small footprints mingling with those of adults in a pattern repeated across countless households. Food preparation carried the same careful awareness. Grain stored in lofts above the stable yard had to be sifted for the fine grit that rain could carry indoors, and the ale brewed in the yard next to the muddy lane was strained through linen to remove whatever the ground had contributed during the rolling of barrels. The mud that clung to hems and sawls was no longer merely an inconvenience. In an age of heightened religious scrutiny, it sometimes carried symbolic weight as well, preachers drawing quiet analogies between the stains of the world and the need for spiritual cleansing, even as the physical reality remained unchanged. Military and administrative movements in the mid-16th century brought these realities into sharper relief during moments of crisis. The campaigns of the Italian wars or the English expeditions to Scotland and France saw armies contending with the same soft ground that had slowed their predecessors. Supply trains laden with powder and shot moved at the deliberate pace dictated by the season, horses straining against traces while soldiers marched with rags wrapped around their boots to gain what little purchase they could. Messengers carrying urgent dispatches from the court in Madrid or Paris arrived at their destinations mud-spattered and weary, their reports sometimes noting the extra days lost to impassable tracks rather than enemy action. In the countryside, the passage of troops left temporary scars, widened ruts, trampled verges, and the occasional abandoned wagon half sunk in a hollow. Local communities, called upon to provide labor or fodder, found their own daily journeys complicated by these disruptions. Yet the underlying negotiation with the earth continued without pause once the soldiers had moved on. As the century advanced toward its middle decades, population growth began to reverse some of the post-plague easing of pressure on the land. More feet and more wheels meant busier lanes in many regions, and the familiar resistance underfoot grew more noticeable during peak seasons of sowing and harvest. In parts of the Low Countries and northern France, where drainage projects had long been a matter of communal survival, villagers expanded earlier experiments with raised causeways and wooden walkways, creating short stretches that offered a firmer tread for those willing to pay a small toll or contribute labor. These innovations were practical and localized, never grand enough to suggest that the mud had been conquered, but they spoke of a society that continued to adapt while accepting the ground's authority. A merchant traveling from Antwerp to Ghent in the 1550s might note with quiet satisfaction the improved sections near the major canals, yet he would still adjust his stride once the improved road gave way to the ordinary lane beyond what we can picture. Then, a late summer afternoon in 1565 somewhere along a well-traveled track in the English West Country or the German Rhineland. The harvest is nearing its close, and a line of reapers makes its way homeward, sickles resting on shoulders, their boots and clogs heavy with the day's accumulated earth. A small cart follows behind, its wheels leaving fresh impressions in the softened surface as it carries the last sheaves toward the barn. In the distance, the village church stands steady against the sky, its yard promising a slightly firmer approach for those who will attend evensong after supper. The air carries the scent of damp soil and cut grain, and the conversation among the workers turns quietly to the weather and the state of the lanes ahead. The world beyond the horizon continues to change with the spread of new doctrines and new forms of governance. Yet here the ground remains the same faithful companion it has always been, ready to receive the next day's footsteps and to shape once more the quiet texture of ordinary existence. The rain will come again when it chooses, the paths will soften in their familiar way, and the story of those who walk them keeps drawing us forward into the unfolding decades of the later 16th century. The rain will come again when it chooses, the paths will soften in their familiar way, and the story of those who walk them keeps drawing us forward into the unfolding decades of the later 16th century. In those years, the lanes of Europe carried the steady tread of a world that felt newly restless with religious debate and expanding horizons. Yet the ground itself refused to hurry or yield. The Elizabethan age in England, for instance, brought a flowering of courtly culture and maritime ambition. But the muddy tracks linking London to the coastal ports or the inland market towns remained the same patient arbiters of pace they had always been. A merchant dispatching cloth or grain to the growing fleet at Deptford might watch his wagons depart at first light, only to learn later that the journey had stretched an extra day because the lanes near Greenwich had turned soft after overnight rain, the wheels sinking to the hubs and requiring teams of laborers to free them. Messengers carrying dispatches from the court still arrived at their destinations with boots caked and cloaks darkened at the hem, the documents inside their satchels kept dry only by the careful oilcloth wrappings that had become standard for those who moved important papers along the roads. In the countryside, the familiar routines persisted with quiet continuity. A tenant farmer in the Midlands or the Weald of Kent would rise before dawn to walk the same path to his strips or enclosed fields, his pattens or sturdy leather boots gathering the same weight of earth that his grandfather had known. The expansion of sheep farming for the wool trade pressed more animals onto the lanes, their hooves churning the surface into a thicker paste during wet seasons and leaving behind a richer, more pungent mixture that clung to everything it touched. Women making their way to the village well or the common pasture lifted their skirts with the same practiced hand, their wooden clogs leaving neat impressions that filled with water behind them. The evening ritual of cleaning footwear and garments by the hearth continued unchanged, now perhaps accompanied by the low murmur of a neighbor reading aloud from a newly acquired English Bible or a printed almanac, the pages themselves having traveled the same muddy routes from the London presses. The mud here carried no preference for old faith or new. It simply received the footsteps of both, slowing the spread of sermons and pamphlets in equal measure while preserving in its layers the occasional discarded page or lost button from a traveler's coat. Across the Channel, the religious wars that swept through France and the Low Countries in the 1560s and 1570s brought the Crown's authority into sharper focus during times of upheaval. Armies of Huguenot or Catholic forces marched along the same tracks that had served pilgrims and merchants for generations, their progress measured not by maps alone but by the state of the soil after each reign. Cannon and supply wagons foundered in the low-lying plains of Picardy or the Flemish countryside, requiring entire companies to wade in and haul them free while scouts kept watch from the firmer verges. Camp followers and local villagers pressed into service learned once more that the mud respected neither creed nor rank. A noble officer's horse could sink as deeply as a common soldier's boot, and the laundresses tending to the army's linens worked knee-deep in the same slurry that had greeted their ancestors. When the fighting paused, local communities returned to their fields and markets, repairing the worst ruts with brushwood and gravel where they could, the labor now sometimes organized by parish elders mindful of both survival and the new religious tensions that divided their neighbors. In the prosperous trading cities of the north, the streets around the exchanges and warehouses saw modest attempts at improvement, yet these were always partial. In Amsterdam or Antwerp, the growth of maritime commerce brought more carts and porters to the quays, pressing the earth harder and widening the channels that ran between the better-paved sections near the great merchant halls. A clerk hurrying to record a cargo of spices or Baltic timber might wear finer hose than before, but he still paused at the threshold to slip on his pattens before crossing the market square, knowing that a single misstep could ruin both footwear and ledger. Householders continued their morning sweeps of the kennel, while civic ordinances grew slightly more detailed in their demands for regular scavenging, especially before major fairs or the arrival of foreign delegations. The scent of damp earth and organic matter still lingered in the air after rain, mingling now with the sharper smells of tar and salt from the ships, a reminder that even in these bustling centers the ground beneath every footstep remained close and unyielding. The daily domestic world adapted in small, practical ways that echoed earlier centuries while reflecting the quiet changes of the age. In a prosperous artisan's house in a German town or an English market village, the beaten earth floor still tracked in the outside world with every entry, yet some households now laid simple rush matting or woven reeds in the main living space to make cleaning easier. Children learning their catechism or the rudiments of reading still played at the edges of the lane, their bare feet or simple rag wrappings permanently stained with the same silt. Food preparation carried the same careful attention to grit and dampness. Grain from the mill had to be winnowed twice if the roads had been wet during transport, and the ale brewed in the yard next to the muddy track was strained more thoroughly to catch whatever the ground had contributed. The mud that clung to hems and soles had become, in the sermons of the day, a quiet metaphor for the stains of the world that faith sought to cleanse. Yet for those who lived close to it, the reality remained thoroughly practical. An ache in the legs after a long day's walk, the small relief of reaching a dry threshold, the patient scraping by firelight before sleep. As the 16th century drew toward its close, population pressures once again began to mount in many regions, bringing more feet and more wheels to the same old paths. In parts of England and the Netherlands, the gradual shift toward more intensive farming and the expansion of cottage industries meant busier lanes during certain seasons, the familiar resistance underfoot growing more noticeable when the harvest wagons rolled or the cloth merchants dispatched their bales. Local authorities in some districts experimented with wider drainage ditches or the occasional laying of stone in high-traffic areas near bridges or fords. Yet these were localized efforts that left the majority of rural tracts much as they had always been. A traveler in the 1590s might notice a newly graveled stretch outside a prosperous manor or guild hall, only to find the improvement end abruptly at the next parish boundary where the old mire resumed its claim. The ground continued to preserve its quiet archive. Layers of silt sealing away fragments of printed broadsheets, broken patens, and the occasional coin lost from a distracted hand. Small witnesses to lives lived in constant conversation with the earth. We can picture, then, a crisp autumn morning in 1598 somewhere along a lane in the English home counties or the Flemish countryside. The harvest is safely gathered, and a small party of farmers makes its way toward the market town. Their boots and clogs heavy with the season's accumulated soil, a cart following behind laden with the last of the season's produce. In the distance, the spire of the parish church rises above the fields, its yard offering firmer footing for those who will pause there on their return. The conversation among the walkers turns quietly to the price of grain and the state of the roads ahead, the familiar rhythm of complaint and acceptance that has marked such journeys for centuries. The world beyond the horizon is alive with new maps of distant oceans and new debates in the pulpits. Yet here on the ground that supports every step the old negotiation continues unchanged. The lanes stretch onward into the 17th century, the rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. The lanes stretch onward into the 17th century, the rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. In the opening decades of the new century, the ground beneath daily life continued its ancient role as the great leveler, even as kings and parliaments grappled with questions of divine right and religious settlement. In Stuart England, the lanes linking London to the shires carried the tread of courtiers and commoners alike during the reign of James I. Yet a royal progress from Whitehall to a hunting lodge in the home counties could still be slowed to a crawl when the heavy coaches sank into ruts softened by autumn rains. Messengers bearing dispatches from the court or from the growing network of overseas merchants arrived with the same familiar stains on their boots and the hems of their cloaks, the letters inside their satchels protected by layers of waxed cloth that had become a standard precaution for those who traveled the roads with any frequency. In the countryside, the patterns of labor and movement echoed the centuries before while absorbing the subtle pressures of a growing population. A yeoman farmer in the Midlands or the West Country would set out each morning along the same track to his enclosed fields or common pasture, his sturdy leather boots or wooden pattens gathering the weight of clay-rich soil that refused to drain quickly in the cooler, wetter climate that still lingered. The expansion of arable farming and the steady increase in sheep flocks meant more traffic on the lanes during sowing and shearing seasons. The surface churned into a thicker, more clinging mixture that turned every journey into a small exercise in patience. Women walking to the village market or the common well lifted their skirts with the same habitual care, their clogs leaving impressions that filled with water behind them, while children running errands tracked the same silt across the beaten earth floors of their homes. The evening ritual of scraping and brushing garments by the hearth fire remained unchanged, now perhaps accompanied by the quiet reading of a newly printed broadside or a page from the King James Bible, the paper itself having made its slow, muddy journey from the London presses. Across the Channel, the 30 Years' War that engulfed much of Central Europe from 1618 onward brought the mud's authority into the foreground of military campaigns in ways that commanders learned to respect. Armies marching through the plains of Germany or the Low Countries found their artillery trains and supply wagons bogged down in the same low-lying tracks that had slowed earlier conflicts, the heavy guns sinking axle-deep after a few days of rain and requiring entire companies of soldiers and impressed laborers to heave them free. Camp followers and local villagers pressed into service waded through the slurry to fetch water or firewood, their pattens or rag-wrapped feet sinking inches deep while the scent of damp earth mingled with the smoke of campfires. When the armies moved on, the lanes bore the scars of their passage, widened ruts, trampled verges, and the occasional abandoned cart half submerged in a hollow. Yet local communities returned to their fields and markets, repairing what they could with brushwood and gravel while the daily negotiation with the ground resumed its patient rhythm. In the prosperous Dutch Republic of the Golden Age, the streets of Amsterdam and other trading cities saw more systematic efforts at improvement, yet these too remained partial and never absolute. The growth of overseas commerce brought heavier traffic to the quays and market squares, pressing the earth harder along the approaches to the great merchant houses and warehouses. Civic authorities funded regular graveling and the laying of stone in high-traffic areas, and the famous canals helped drain some of the worst accumulations, but the side streets and the roads leading out into the countryside stayed soft underfoot after any prolonged rain. A merchant hurrying to the exchange with news of a spice shipment from the East Indies might wear finer hose and polished shoes, yet he still kept pattens ready at his doorway, knowing that the short walk across the square could still claim its toll. Householders continued their morning sweeps of the kennel, while the scent of damp earth and the faint organic matter from the canals lingered in the air, a reminder that even in this age of maritime wealth and artistic flourishing, the ground beneath every footstep refused to be entirely subdued. The daily domestic world adapted with the same quiet practicality that had marked earlier generations. In a prosperous artisan's house in a German town or an English market village, simple rush matting or woven reeds might now cover the main living space to ease the task of cleaning. Yet the beaten earth floors still carried in the outside world with every entry. Children learning their letters from a hornbook or a printed primer still played at the edges of the lane, their small feet or rag wrappings permanently darkened by the silt. Food preparation carried the familiar attention to grit and dampness. Grain from the mill had to be winnowed carefully if the roads had been wet, and the ale brewed in the yard next to the muddy track was strained through linen to catch whatever the ground had contributed during the rolling of barrels. The mud that clung to hems and sawls appeared occasionally in sermons or moral pamphlets as a metaphor for worldly entanglements, yet for those who lived close to it the reality remained thoroughly practical. The low-grade ache in the calves after a long day, the small satisfaction of reaching a dry threshold, the patient scraping by firelight before the household settled for the night. As the 17th century moved into its middle decades, the ground continued to witness the interplay of larger events and ordinary movement. The English Civil War of the 1640s turned many rural lanes into routes for marching armies and supply trains, the mud slowing both royalist and parliamentary forces in equal measure and preserving in its layers the occasional discarded musket ball or fragment of a soldier's boot. Messengers carrying urgent letters between London and the provinces arrived mud-spattered and weary, their reports sometimes noting the extra days lost to impassable tracks rather than enemy action. In the countryside, the familiar tracks between villages and fields bore the additional weight of troops and refugees, yet once the conflict eased, the daily round of plowing and harvest resumed, the earth absorbing the temporary disruption as it had absorbed so many before. We can picture, then, a damp spring morning in 1655 somewhere along a lane in the English Midlands or the Dutch countryside. The fields are being prepared for sowing, and a small group of laborers makes its way from the village, their boots and clogs heavy with the overnight softening, a cart following behind laden with seed sacks. In the distance, the parish church stands steady, its yard promising a slightly firmer footing for those who will pause there later in the day. The conversation among the walkers turns quietly to the price of grain and the state of the roads ahead, the familiar rhythm of endurance and adaptation that has marked such journeys for centuries. The world beyond the horizon is alive with new scientific inquiries and new forms of governance. Yet here on the ground that supports every step, the old conversation continues unchanged. The lanes stretch onward through the later decades of the century. The rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. The lanes stretch onward through the later decades of the century, the rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. In the closing years of the 17th century and the early decades of the 18th, the ground beneath daily life continued its patient work even as the political map of Europe was redrawn by wars of succession and the first stirrings of what would later be called the Enlightenment. In Restoration England, after the return of the monarchy in 1660, the lanes radiating from London to the provincial towns still demanded the same careful negotiation they had known under the Stuarts. A courtier traveling to a country estate or a merchant carrying samples of new imported silks from the docks might set out in a lighter carriage than before, yet after a night of rain the wheels would sink into the familiar ruts, forcing the driver to halt and recruit passing laborers to push while the passengers stepped down into the soft earth, lifting their finer shoes with the same practiced caution as any village laborer. The parish system of road maintenance, established by earlier statutes, placed responsibility on local communities, yet funds and labor were often in short supply, leaving many routes little better than the broad, dusty tracks that turned to clinging clay when the weather turned. In the countryside, the rhythms of agricultural life remained tethered to the soil in ways that felt almost timeless. A tenant farmer in the fertile but heavy lands of the Midlands or East Anglia would walk the same lanes to his fields each dawn, his boots or pattens gathering the weight of the clay that had defied drainage for centuries. The gradual introduction of new crops and rotations in some regions brought extra carts during harvest, pressing the surface harder and widening the hollows where water collected after autumn showers. Women carrying milk or cheese to the nearest market lifted their skirts and adjusted their clogs with habitual grace, their steps measured against the soft patches they had learned to avoid over years of repetition. Children sent on errands to the mill or the blacksmith's forge still returned with feet darkened by the same silt, tracking it across the beaten earth floors of cottages where rush matting offered only partial relief. The evening task of cleaning garments and footwear by the hearth persisted, now perhaps accompanied by the low light of a tallow candle and the quiet discussion of news from a printed gazette that had itself traveled the muddy roads from London, its pages slightly warped from the damp of the journey. Across the Channel similar conditions prevailed amid the ambitions of Louis XIV's France and the shifting alliances of the War of the Spanish Succession. Armies marching through the Low Countries or the plains of northern Germany found their supply trains and artillery slowed by the same soft ground that had hindered earlier campaigns, the heavy wagons sinking into lanes already churned by weeks of rain and troop movements. Local villagers pressed into service to clear paths or haul stalled equipment waded through the slurry, their wooden pattens or rag-wrapped feet sinking inches deep while the scent of damp earth mingled with the smoke of campfires and the sharper smells of gunpowder. When the soldiers departed, the lanes bore temporary scars, yet the daily round of plowing and market journeys resumed, the earth absorbing the disruption as it had absorbed so many before. In the Dutch Republic, where commerce and drainage had long gone hand in hand, the major routes between Amsterdam and other trading centers saw occasional improvements funded by tolls and civic pride. Yet even these better-maintained paths could become treacherous after prolonged wet weather, their gravel surfaces softening into the familiar paste that clung to boots and slowed packhorses laden with goods from the east. Urban streets in growing cities like Paris, London, or Edinburgh told a parallel story of ambition meeting the stubborn reality of the ground. Civic authorities expanded efforts to pave key thoroughfares near palaces and exchanges. Yet the side alleys and the approaches to the gates remained soft and yielding. A clerk hurrying to the Royal Exchange or a lawyer making his way to the Inns of Court might wear polished leather shoes, but he still kept a pair of pattens at his lodgings for the short walk across squares where rainwater pooled in the channels between stones. Householders continued their morning sweeps of the kennel, while scavengers pushed their barrows along the central drains with greater regularity before important gatherings or royal processions. The scent of damp earth and organic matter still rose after rain, mingling now with the sharper odors of coal smoke and the new imports that arrived by ship, a quiet reminder that even in these centers of power and fashion the ground beneath every footstep refused to surrender entirely. The domestic world adapted with the same quiet ingenuity that had marked earlier generations. In a modest town house or a prosperous farmstead, the beaten earth floors or simple flagstones still carried in the outside world with every entry, though some households now laid thicker layers of rushes or woven straw to ease the daily cleaning. Food preparation reflected the same careful awareness of grit and dampness. Grain stored after a wet journey from the mill had to be winnowed more thoroughly, and the ale or small beer brewed in the yard next to the muddy lane was strained through cloth to remove whatever the earth had contributed. The mud that clung to hems and sawls appeared occasionally in moral tracts or sermons as a symbol of earthly trials, yet for those who lived with it the experience remained thoroughly practical. The steady ache in the legs after a long day's labor, the small satisfaction of scraping one's shoes clean at the threshold, the patient brushing by firelight before the household settled into sleep. As the 18th century advanced, the ground began to witness the first tentative steps toward more organized change. In parts of England, the earliest turnpike trusts, authorized by parliamentary acts, began to improve selected stretches of major roads with gravel and better drainage, funded by tolls collected at gates. These improvements offered faster travel for those who could afford the fees, yet they remained limited to the busiest routes, leaving countless rural lanes and secondary paths much as they had always been. A traveler on a turnpiked highway might notice a firmer tread underfoot during drier months, only to find the old resistance return once the improved section ended at the next parish boundary. In the countryside, the slow spread of new agricultural ideas, such as better drainage ditches in low-lying fields, brought modest relief to some holdings, yet the connecting tracks between villages often lagged behind, their surfaces still yielding to every cartwheel and boot. The mud continued to preserve its quiet archive in waterlogged deposits, sealing away fragments of printed newspapers, broken patens, and the occasional coin lost from a distracted hand, small witnesses to lives lived in constant conversation with the earth. We can picture, then, a misty morning in 1725 somewhere along a lane in the English West Country or the Flemish hinterland. The fields are being prepared for spring sowing, and a small group of laborers makes its way from the village, their boots and clogs heavy with the overnight softening, a cart following behind laden with seed and tools. In the distance, the parish church stands steady against the low sky, its yard promising a slightly firmer footing for those who will pause there later. The conversation among the walkers turns quietly to the price of grain, the state of the roads ahead, and rumors of new toll gates on the main highway to the city. The world beyond the horizon is alive with new scientific societies and new debates in coffee houses. Yet here on the ground that supports every step, the old negotiation continues unchanged. The lanes stretch onward into the middle decades of the century. The rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. In the middle years of the 18th century, the first widespread turnpike trusts had begun to transform selected highways into firmer, better-drained routes funded by tolls at gated barriers. Yet these improvements touched only the busiest arteries linking major cities and left the vast network of rural lanes and secondary paths largely untouched. A merchant traveling from Manchester to Liverpool on a newly turnpiked road might notice the relative firmness beneath his carriage wheels during drier spells, the surface graveled and cambered to shed water more effectively. But once he turned off toward a market town or village, the old resistance returned without apology, the wheels sinking once more into the familiar clay that had greeted travelers for centuries. Local farmers and carters learned quickly which stretches justified the toll and which routes remained free but punishing, adjusting their journeys with the same practical calculus their ancestors had applied to weather and season alone. In the countryside, the slow spread of agricultural improvements, from new crop rotations to better plow designs, brought more traffic to the lanes during sowing and harvest without fundamentally altering their character. A tenant on an estate in the Scottish lowlands or the heavy soils of East Anglia would still set out each morning along the same track to his fields, his boots or reinforced pattens gathering the weight of earth that refused to drain quickly even after decades of incremental drainage ditches. The increased cultivation of turnips and clover meant heavier wagons moving between fields and barns, pressing deeper ruts into the surface and creating hollows that filled with standing water after any autumn shower. Women walking to the common or the nearest mill lifted their skirts with habitual care, their wooden clogs leaving impressions that children followed on their way to school or errands, the silt tracking indoors to the beaten earth floors where fresh rushes offered only temporary relief. The evening labor of cleaning garments and footwear by the hearth continued as it always had, now perhaps illuminated by a slightly brighter tallow candle and accompanied by the rustle of a provincial newspaper whose pages had themselves traveled the muddy roads from a printing house in the nearest county town. Across Britain and the continent similar patterns held amid the ambitions of enlightened monarchs and the early stirrings of industrial enterprise. In France under the later Bourbons, the royal administration encouraged the improvement of main routes to support trade and military movement. Yet the side lanes and village paths remained the domain of local custom and communal labor. Armies marching toward the borders during the War of the Austrian Succession or the 7 Years' War found their supply trains slowed by the same soft ground that had hindered earlier campaigns, the artillery pieces and provision wagons sinking into ruts churned by weeks of rain and marching feet. Local villagers impressed to clear paths or haul stalled equipment waded through the slurry with the same quiet endurance their grandparents had shown, their pattens or rag-wrapped feet sinking inches deep while the scent of damp earth mingled with the smoke of campfires. When the troops departed, the lanes bore temporary scars, yet the daily round of market journeys and field work resumed, the earth absorbing the disruption as it had absorbed so many before. In the growing manufacturing districts of England and the Low Countries, the first factories and workshops began to draw workers along the same old tracks, the increased foot traffic only compounding the familiar resistance. A weaver or ironworker walking from a village cottage to a new mill might carry a small bundle of tools, his boots heavy with the clay that clung more stubbornly after overnight rain, while carts laden with raw cotton or coal pressed the lanes harder still. Urban authorities in places like Birmingham or Manchester expanded paving efforts around the new exchanges and warehouses, yet the residential alleys and the roads leading out into the surrounding countryside stayed soft underfoot. A clerk hurrying to record shipments of finished goods might wear sturdier shoes than his rural counterpart, but he still paused at the threshold to slip on pattens before crossing squares where rainwater pooled in the channels between stones. Householders continued their morning sweeps of the kennel, while the scent of damp earth rose after rain, mingling now with the sharper smells of coal smoke and the dyes from the new textile works. A quiet reminder that even in these centers of innovation, the ground beneath every footstep remained close and unyielding. The domestic world adapted with the same patient ingenuity that had marked earlier generations. In a modest terrace house or a prosperous farmstead, the floors, whether beaten earth or simple flagstones, still carried in the outside world with every entry, though some households now laid thicker layers of straw or woven matting to ease the daily cleaning. Children attending the new charity schools or dame schools still played at the edges of the lane, their small feet or simple boots permanently darkened by the silt. Food preparation reflected the same careful awareness of grit and dampness. Grain or meal from the mill had to be sifted more thoroughly if the roads had been wet during transport, and the small beer brewed in the yard next to the muddy track was strained through cloth to remove whatever the earth had contributed. The mud that clung to hems and sawls appeared occasionally in moral pamphlets or improving tracts as a symbol of earthly toil, yet for those who lived with it the experience remained thoroughly practical. The steady ache in the legs after a long day, the small satisfaction of scraping one's shoes clean at the threshold, the patient brushing by firelight before the household settled into sleep. As the 18th century moved toward its later decades, these daily accommodations began to intersect with the first clear signs of broader transformation. The turnpike system expanded steadily, and in some regions the earliest canal networks offered an alternative to the lanes stretch onward into the closing years of the century. The rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. In the final decades of the 18th century, the ground beneath daily life stood in quiet contrast to the accelerating pace of ideas and inventions that were beginning to reshape the continent. The French Revolution, unfolding from 1789 onward, turned many rural lanes and urban streets into corridors of upheaval. Yet the mud itself imposed its own unhurried discipline on events. Peasant farmers in the provinces of Brittany or the Île-de-France, marching toward Paris to join the great festivals of liberty or to deliver petitions, found their wooden clogs and rag-wrapped feet sinking into the same heavy soils that had slowed their ancestors during the wars of religion. Supply carts laden with grain for the revolutionary armies often bogged down on the roads to the capital, requiring entire villages to turn out with ropes and levers, their legs caked to the knees by the time the wagons were freed. Even the grand processions carrying the Declaration of the Rights of Man moved with deliberate caution along softened thoroughfares, the hems of tricolor sashes darkened by the same earth that had once received the footsteps of royal processions orst of the muddy roads for bulk goods. Yet the lanes that served ordinary people, the paths to the field, the market, the workshop, remained much as they had always been. A traveler on a well-maintained turnpike might enjoy a smoother journey for a few miles, only to find the old resistance return once the improved section ended at the next parish or county boundary. In the countryside, the enclosure movement in England and similar land reforms elsewhere brought new hedges and boundaries. Yet the connecting tracks between villages often grew busier rather than quieter, as population increased and small industries spread. The ground continued to preserve its quiet archive in waterlogged deposits, sealing away fragments of printed broadsheets, broken patens, and the occasional coin or tool lost from a distracted hand. Small witnesses to lives lived in constant conversation with the earth. We can picture, then, a cool autumn morning in 1775 somewhere along a lane in the English Midlands or the French countryside near Lyon. The fields are being prepared for winter sowing, and a small group of laborers makes its way from the village, their boots and clogs heavy with the overnight softening, a cart following behind laden with seed and implements. In the distance, the parish church or village steeple stands steady against the low sky, its yard promising a slightly firmer footing for those who will pause there later. The conversation among the walkers turns quietly to the price of bread, the state of the roads ahead, and rumors of new machines being installed in the nearby mill. The world beyond the horizon is alive with new ideas of liberty and new experiments in manufacturing. Yet here on the ground that supports every step, the old negotiation continues unchanged. The lanes stretch onward into the closing years of the century. The rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. The lanes stretch onward into the closing years of the century. The rain will return in its own time, and the earth waits patiently to receive whatever footsteps the coming years will bring, ready as always to shape the quiet texture of ordinary existence in a Europe that is both changing and steadfastly the same. And so, as we have followed these paths from the open fields and village lanes of the high Middle Ages through the towns and cities of later centuries, we return at last to the simple, unromantic truth that anchored it all. For the vast majority of people who lived in medieval Europe, and for generations afterward, the mud was never an interruption in daily life but its very foundation. It was the ground they knew, the companion that met every step, the quiet force that slowed carts, stained garments, preserved fragments of the past, and reminded everyone, peasant and lord, artisan and merchant, that the world beneath their feet had its own unhurried authority. What we have glimpsed is not merely a catalogue of inconveniences but a deeper understanding of how that yielding earth quietly ordered the pace of existence. The same heavy clay that turned paths into ribbons of slurry after a gentle rain shaped the rhythms of plowing and harvest, the careful planning of market journeys, the small domestic labors of scraping boots and brushing wool by firelight. It limited how far news could travel in a day, how quickly armies could move, how trade could expand, and yet it also sustained the very agriculture that fed growing populations and preserved, in its waterlogged layers, the leather sawls, wooden patens, and lost coins that let us reconstruct those lives with unexpected intimacy. Medieval people did not romanticize it. They adapted to it with quiet practicality, raising their feet on patens, laying brushwood across the worst hollows, sweeping the stretch of street before their doors, because the mud was simply the condition of the world they inherited, as ordinary as the rain that fed it or the short winter days that framed it. Over the long arc we have traced, that condition endured far beyond the medieval centuries, persisting through plague and war, through the slow spread of enclosures and turnpikes, through the first factories and the stirrings of new ideas, because the heavy soils and damp northern climate refused to be hurried. The cathedrals rose, the manuscripts were copied, the songs were sung, the ships sailed for distant shores, yet beneath it all lay the patient, unyielding earth that people negotiated every single day. Understanding this changes how we see the medieval world, not as a place of unrelenting hardship alone, but as one of resilient, grounded ingenuity, where beauty and belief coexisted with the practical realities of wet feet and heavy hems, where communities found ways to keep moving forward even when the ground itself seemed to pull them back. In the end, the story of walking through mud every day in medieval Europe is the story of lives lived close to the land in the most literal sense. Lives measured not in grand events but in the steady accumulation of small, repeated acts of endurance and adaptation. The paths may have been softened or paved in later ages, yet the memory of that soft ground lingers in the very shape of our countryside, in the faint impressions still uncovered by archaeologists, and in the quiet recognition that even the most ordinary detail of the past can reveal something profound about the human experience. If this long journey into the unromantic realities of medieval life has left you with one detail that lingers as you listen tonight, what has it been? The weight of a mud-caked paten at the end of a long day, the patient sweep of a broom across a village street, or the way the same earth that slowed progress also preserved the traces of those who walked upon it. Perhaps you might share that thought when the time feels right. And if these calm, thoughtful explorations of the past have helped you unwind and see history in a gentler light, I would be grateful if you joined us for the next quiet descent into another corner of the past. Your subscription keeps these long, immersive stories arriving steadily. Until then, rest well, and thank you for walking these muddy paths with me.